Larry, great to talk to you.
Always a pleasure to spend time with you, Ginny. How are you?
Pretty darn good. I'm here at the UN, and I read your article about the Chicago Times article where the Chicago's police department gave firearm trace data to the University of Chicago Crime Lab for a study the department had requested. You say that data should never have been released and that the city actually violated federal law. Tell us about what they did.
Well, the City of Chicago Police Superintendent, who should be known to your listeners because he has a rather checkered past, his Police Superintendent McCarthy, who used to work for Mayor Bloomberg and then became the police commissioner in Newark, New Jersey under Cory Booker, obtained trace data from ATF and then turned that trace data over to academics at the University of Chicago, who is a long history. This person that runs this center at the University of Chicago has a long association with Rahm Emanuel, with the Joyce Foundation, and George Soros to generate a so-called study off of the trace data, which produced rather unremarkable findings, like most guns recovered in Chicago were originally sold at retail in Illinois, a fact that is true of every state. The number one source state for firearms is that state itself. Mm-hmm. But what's important is that, and why we wrote the blog, is because by turning that raw trace data over to the University of Chicago, the Chicago Police Department violated federal law. They violated the so-called Tiahrt Amendment that expressly says that the data, trace data, is for law enforcement only and cannot be released outside of law enforcement. And they did not. So they gave this data to the University of Chicago. I confirmed that in email traffic with the head of this center. Did you get this data? First of all, could I have a copy of the report? And the answer was no. Mm-hmm. They would not provide a copy of the report, even though the police folks gave it to the media. That's why we saw the news stories. But they admitted, I said, did you get trace data from the Chicago Police Department? And they confirmed that they did get trace data from the Chicago Police Department. And that's a violation of federal law. It's plain and simple.
I mean, is this just another case, another example of how Chicago continues to thumb its nose at the Supreme Court, at our laws? You just wonder, where does it end?
Well, it's clearly a violation of federal law. It violates the Tiahrt Amendment. And again, what's interesting as well is, Chicago has a long history with the issue of trace data in the first place. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Chicago is one of the reasons why the Tiahrt Amendment came to be in the first place. Right. Remember, about 10 years ago, the city of Chicago was among the cities suing the firearms industry, purporting to blame the industry members for the criminal misuse of firearms and trying to recover millions and millions of dollars, as well as to impose injunctions and regulate how firearms are sold through these lawsuits. As part of their lawsuit, they sought to obtain trace data from ATF. Not just trace data for the city of Chicago, but they wanted national trace data. ATF said, no, we can't disclose that information to you because of privacy concerns about the consumer, because it could interfere with law enforcement investigations, because of the privacy interests of the retailers who sold the firearms. And again, just because a trace was made doesn't mean that the retailer has done anything wrong at all. But it's because so that got litigated by the city of Chicago. That case against ATF went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And while the case was pending before the United States Supreme Court, Congress enacted the Tiahrt Amendment to stop the misuse of data because, of course, Chicago and these other cities use the data as a proxy for actual evidence to try and say, well, look at all these traces. The industry must be responsible for creating a public nuisance because of all of these traces, even though they had no actual evidence of any kind whatsoever that anybody in the industry had, done any of these horrible things they accused us of. And they also were interfering, it ended up interfering with investigations. So it's because of the city of Chicago's lawsuit and lawsuits by New York City and L.A. and the NAACP, et cetera, against the industry, that Congress enacted the Tiahrt Amendment. Our dear friend in New York, Judge Weinstein, before whom the New York City case was pending and the NAACP case was tried, repeatedly issued rulings to avoid the Tiahrt Amendment. Congress kept coming back and tightening the Tiahrt Amendment and strengthening the language to make its purpose and intent very clear. And it is very clear now. It's crystal clear. You can't release it outside of law enforcement. And that's exactly what the city of Chicago did. And interestingly, to sort of complete the mosaic here, the police commissioner of Chicago now, Mr. McCarthy, was with the New York City Police Department back in 2006 when Mayor Bloomberg and his police department obtained what? Trace data that they turned over to private investigators who then used that trace data to go out and do these so-called simulated straw purchases, which interfered in as many as 18 ongoing criminal investigations, required ATF to pull agents out of the field because of the potential risk of harm to their agents. And at the end of the day, the Department of Justice wrote a letter to the city of New York and said, none of the dealers that you've accused have violated any federal law, but however, don't do what you did again because you may have violated federal law. And when I found out about 2 years ago, because I attended a panel discussion by a group called the Police Research Foundation and sat right next to Mr. McCarthy, and by the point I made about those Bloomberg stings was that Mayor Bloomberg hadn't even bothered to tell the police commissioner because Ray Kelly, the police commissioner, had given a television interview and said, we, the New York City Police Department, knew nothing about it. Well, Mr. McCarthy corrected me and said, yes, we did know about it because I got the trace data and gave it to the private eyes, which was what? A violation of the Tiahrt Amendment.
And the same old players keeps going, right?
Yeah, well, let me just then, the final point to make is in this report, which we've asked the Chicago Police Department to give us a copy. They have not bothered to return a phone call or email. The University of Chicago will not produce the report, even though it was paid for by public dollars, but they've given it to the media. In that report, because it's mentioned in the editorial, is that they calls for more stings of gun dealers.
Yeah, I saw that.
Which, of course, is what Mr. McCarthy was involved in under Mayor Bloomberg. We just didn't know it at the time.
Yeah. Got to ask you, are you looking at taking any action against Chicago to make sure they don't keep doing this or try to do it again?
Well, unfortunately, we as industry would not have a legal basis to assert a violation of the Tiahrt Amendment. We have raised our objections with ATF and said this is a clear violation of the Tiahrt Amendment, and we expect them to do something about it. They are now aware of it, and we fully intend to make Congress aware of this and the appropriators, so they are aware that the appropriation rider is being violated by places like the city of Chicago, and so hopefully we'll see Congress take some action to put some teeth into the language so that if there's a violation, there are some serious consequences and sanctions imposed for violating the Tiahrt Amendment. Otherwise, they can violate the law with impunity.
All righty, well, keep us posted. I'll tell you what, it sure would be interesting to see who paid for this study. Was it taxpayers' dollars?
I'm sure it's taxpayers' money.